This is Duke University.
All black, everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Professor Ruth Nicole Brown, Assistant Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She is the author of Black Girlhood Celebration Towards a Hip-Hop Feminist Pedagogy, which was published by Peter Lang in 2008, and the brand new Hear Our Truths, The Creative Potential of Black Girlhood, published by the University of Illinois Press. How are you doing today, Professor Ruth Nicole Brown?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing very well also. I am so excited about your book, in part because I have two rambunctious girls, age 15 and 11. And just on a simply selfish level, I was hoping to find some sort of strategies, at least to deal with my 11-year-old. But what you really do here is make an incredible intervention in the ways that we think about black girls, but in particular this idea of black girlhood. Can you talk a little bit, we know what our society thinks about black girls. Can you talk about this idea of black girlhood? And again, I love this line that you mentioned very early in the book. Black girlhood is freedom, and black girls are free. Can you expound upon that a little bit?
Thanks so much for asking. So what I'm trying to do is create this space of black girlhood as more than identity, but a visionary landscape for us to articulate the things that we want, the things that we need, the things that we enjoy, as a space of coming together. And so for me, black girlhood functions more as sort of a theoretical concept to imagine what we want it to be. And then the work of Soul High is really to enact that, to make that space as we see it.
So talk about this acronym for a second, Soul Hot, which is easy to remember, but what it stands for is Saving Our Lives, Hear Our Truths. Unpack that a little bit for the audience.
Okay, so black girlhood as the theoretical construct is us just really trying to dream about it. Soul High is actually us trying to put it in practice. And it consists of whoever wants to participate really, but we have black girls in the group always. And then we have what we call homegirls who actually do a lot of the labor in terms of actually making the space, creating the time, and setting it up so we can know something that feels like freedom, because unfortunately, we can't ever assume that in terms of the spaces we occupy or what we are bringing with us.
And the homegirls typically are adult women?
Yeah, they're typically adult women who are drawn by this call of reimagining black girlhood as a space of freedom.
You talk later in the book about this concept of homegirling. And, having these women make the distinction between giving time and making time. And it's a fascinating and phenomenal distinction, because I think so many of us, particularly when we're living professional lives, there's a lot of pressure for us to give time. We hear that a lot, right? Particularly those of us, black middle class, it's part of our toolkit of black middle class guilt. Where can we give time? But you frame that very differently around making time. Talk a little bit about those distinctions.
Oh, absolutely. And those who come to Soul High to give time usually don't last very long, because this idea of making time, as you pointed out, it takes all the resources. It takes financial, physical, psychic, emotional resources that a lot of people aren't very well practiced in making, specifically for black girls. It allows you it requires you to have a sense of self, but then also at the same time to be completely sort of egoless. So it's a lot of work in terms of preparing and making time. And actually, in the chapter where I talk to those who have done homegirling, I honestly didn't know actually how much labor it required to make time until we sat down and had conversations about it. But Soul Hot rearranges people's sense of self, sense of purpose, sense of identity. And a lot of that happens through the way they manipulate time. And it can get very futuristic, science fiction, but the practice of it means that we all show up ready. And so that's how I know that it happens.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Ruth Nicole Brown, who's Assistant Professor of Educational Policy and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's the author of 2 books, Black Girlhood Celebration Towards a Hip-Hop Feminist Pedagogy, Peter Lang, 2008, and the brand new Hear Our Truths, The Creative Potential of Black Girlhood, published by the University of Illinois Press. Your first intervention around this work, at least the major intervention, is not necessarily around research, but translating research into a performance piece that you called Tiara, named after one of the girls that you were working with, Endangered Black Girls Instruction 301, a stage play based on the lived experience of black girls. Talk a little bit about this distinction that you call, in that chapter of performance ethnography, versus the more traditional social science research that we're, more likely to see around black girls and black boys also, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to make the space of Black girlhood as a space of freedom requires us to transgress so much. And a lot of that also includes disciplinary boundaries and also coming off of the page. So I need performance in a very real way to articulate some of the things that we are doing. I feel like performance allows us to do that. And we started doing a lot of theatrical work, and a lot of that was written around, as you said, actually the girl stories that I wrote about in my dissertation. And Tiara in particular was interesting because we get that black girl too. I mean, while the lens of the loud black girl is very much present in our thinking, we have girls in Soul Hot and girls that I worked with who are extremely quiet. I mean, don't speak a lot, even sometimes when invited. Tiara was that girl. She rarely spoke. And so she gave me one line, really, and this is after years of working with her in the interview, in the home, in all these different contexts. I'm 5'4", something like that. She says, I'm brown and I got black hair. And I thought, wow, this was her profound statement. So I needed performance to add the context to it. And I needed some imaginative capacity to do that.
Yeah. One of the other strategies that you use in the book around those girls, how do we read, for instance, black girls' silence? How do we read their sass? And the chapter where you talk about, these kind of photographic essays, the idea of what we see when black girls are actually looking at us through the camera, looking at us and their responses. And it's fascinating because we're all familiar with those looks. We see those looks all the time. I mean, in fact, that's very often a black girl's first line of defense. Can you tell how I'm looking at you? Talk about how important it was to bring that kind of photographic imagery into the conversation as another way to get into the minds and the ideas and the creative potential of black girls.
Well, we've always used images in Soul Hot and always placed the cameras with the girls and with ourselves. And we also had our homegirl, Candy Taff, who also had a very skilled eye in terms of taking pictures. And so what I wanted to do in that chapter was really, it's layered because it's what they saw and then it's also what I saw on top of that. So it's like intersubjectivity I was trying to play with. They absolutely see you looking at them. And what I wanted to do with the images was to show that and to raise, actually, I hope, a lot of questions about the ways that we view black girls and what we don't see.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Ruth Nicole Brown, who's the author of the brand new book, Hear Our Truths, The Creative Potential of Black Girlhood, University of Illinois Press. Ruth Nicole, the larger structures that we belong to, both in terms of our disciplines and the institutions that we teach at, there's an expectation that when we say that we're doing research on, say, black girls and black boys, that what we're going to revel in is the kind of pathology that circulates there. I mean, that's the kind of expectation. And I think we always expect to be in combat, for lack of a better way to describe it, with many of these journals and many of the quote unquote leaders in the field, with, departmental colleagues. But you tell a story in the book, when you do a kind of performance of the piece and you're there with the girls and they're responding to questions, of an older black female colleague, who simply walks up to you and asks you, who gave you permission to do this work? How do you deal with what ultimately is the policing of this kind of cutting edge new research by folks who clearly, obviously, have established their voice in the field, but also may not be as comfortable as taking advantage of things around digital technology and social media and all the tools that you use at your disposal to really reach these girls?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the critique is important. The context is absolutely important. And so much of what we're trying to do as an imaginative space of Black girlhood is create. And really to get into some of those creative arguments requires all the tools at our disposal. And I think that, and a lot of sort of manipulating forms that we're used to. I'm very dedicated to try to manipulate words on the page and the spaces to transform those spaces. Hip hop has taught me how to do that. You've taught me how to do that through such shows like this, the work of Dr. Elaine Richardson, who writes, sings, performs. And so there are blueprints that I'm looking to in terms of doing things differently. And I think that the students appreciate it. The girls in Soul High only know it to be that. And I think that it gives it a sort of credibility, and we do it with a kind of non-apology, non-permission seeking that you just can't really deny it if you've seen it.
One of the most moving chapters for me, chapter 4, if you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. You know, when Black girls narrate their stories of violence, talk about the difficulty of getting them to talk about, you know, when they have to engage in forms of violence, you know, as a form of protection. And of course, this is across gender, right? This is not just fighting amongst girls, but also across gender.
Right, absolutely. And so much of what I want to talk about are the gender distinctions and implications of violence, because we're used to it, violence being a certain way, but when you're talking about how it's racialized and gender, so much of it is comes up interpersonally. The punishment also looks different. So, for example, it may be, you know, complete policing rather than necessarily getting kicked out. And unfortunately, it wasn't that hard for them to talk about violence in the chapter. That's a lot of what was so present in our conversation. How are you doing? Well, did you hear about this fight I had? Or she had this fight today. I mean, it was always a part of the conversation. So much so I really did not want to actually go there, but I could not, because that was the issue when I asked them about what was most important for the girls that I talked to at this school. The issue for them was fighting, and fighting not being a choice.
There's a scene in the book you talk about sitting there working with the girls, and they're loud, right? I love this idea that you talk about, you know, in terms of being involved with these girls. Black girls are loud, right? You cannot come into the room and ask them to be quiet, right? That's kind of a default position for them, right? And also this notion of creating authority with them, but not discipline them. Right. You know, it reminds me a lot of someone like Ella Baker and her whole idea about the civil rights movement, right? Her idea was to create not leaders, but to create leadership, right? And those are two very different concepts. But you talk about this scene where you're with the girls and they're making noise, and a white woman walks in to discipline them, right, for all their noise. And one of the things she says is that, you know, you're not acting ladylike. Talk a little bit about the pressures on Black girls around this notion, and again, it fits into this narrative around fighting, about what it means for a Black girl to be ladylike, right? And particularly in conversations around Black respectability politics, that if you're an 11 and 12-year-old Black girl, that you're supposed to comport yourself a certain kind of way. You're supposed to make clothing choices that represent, in the worst case scenario, the race in the best way. Talk about what it was like for you talking with these girls, trying to navigate these kind of pressures in their everyday lives.
Right, absolutely. That's great. So volume is one of those key strategies. I feel like, you know, if we're comfortable, if there's freedom, it sounds a lot like loud, but we're totally, you know, in control of it usually. And so one of the things that was interesting with that example in the book was that we were in a room, like this lady had to come from around multiple corners to come into the room to find us, like, you know, because it was kind of like they actually sound like they're having a good time, and they sound like Black girls. That can't happen here in the space of the school, or that usually doesn't happen. So let me go and try to police what's going on, because it must be wrong. Black girls having a good time together. So she came in and she did not, she didn't even look around the room in terms of who was there. She just went into straight, like, you know, you all need to act like ladies. And I'm like, whoa, you know, this is, in the way it's very textbook, in the way that other scholars have written about it, there was no hesitation in her voice. And so this idea to be a lady, which really translates into, we need you to act like white middle class girls, really is what it is. Because that's what I'm comfortable with, because that's what I was usually in that space in terms of doing the disciplining. And that is quote unquote what this institution values. And so we reject that categorically in Soul High. In terms of being present, there has to be different wider range. I mean, I identify as working class. That's how I grew up. And so a lot of this stuff is just what the institution expects of us. And what Soul Hot does is try to articulate a space to say, well, that may or may not be who we are, what we like to do, but you also have to consider these other examples. And I think when the lady came in, the girls went silent. And so I thought it was also interesting in how she came in to tell us to be quiet, but then she demanded an apology from them. And so when they didn't speak, she got really upset. Like, so it came in like, be quiet. And then she left demanding that they make some noise. And I thought, wow, okay, this is a lot to negotiate.
What I found very interesting about that scene was, you kicking into researcher mode. Yeah. And not wanting to intervene on their behalf, right? Just seeing how the girls were going to react, to this situation, which I think from a researcher standpoint was just brilliant. Just get out of the way, right? Because I imagine even in your own black girl sense, right, you wanted to get at this woman also.
Yeah, I wanted to actually complete reading the room at that point. I mean, my impulse was to check this lady real quick. And then I thought, wow, this is what they deal with all the time, though. They're actually much more skilled. I'm not in a middle school. I mean, I'm in there a lot, but not as much as they are. This is a space that they know. So I went to following their lead to see what they did. And it was a lot of nonverbal communication. They knew this scene. They were familiar with it. And it was like, they handled it. And then after she left, they went on like, okay, what were we talking about? They were over it.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Ruth Nicole Brown, Assistant Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Ruth Nicole, what's next for you?
Oh, well, we're picking up from the last chapter in terms of I talk about the original music we create in Soul Hot, and looking at what we call Black Girl Genius and Soul Hot. So much of that is tied to the original music making we're doing. So you can expect musical concerts from us, CDs, just to really, we're looking to your work, to Ramsey's work in terms of trying to identify the relationship between Black girl music making and this idea of racialized Black genius, what it looks like, particularly for Black girls, because we often don't talk about genius and Black girlhoods together, but I know so many, and I'm so excited to talk about the music we make.
I love the photo of Aaliyah sitting there behind you over your shoulder.
Yeah, yeah, I want you all to know and remember Aaliyah.
We have been joined today by Professor Ruth Nicole Brown, Assistant Professor of Educational Policy Studies and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's the author of Black Girlhood Celebration Towards a Hip-Hop Feminist Pedagogy, which was published by Peter Lang in 2008, and also the author of the brand new book, Hear Our Truths, The Creative Potential of Black Girlhood, which was just published by the University of Illinois Press. Thanks for joining us, Ruth Nicole.
Thanks so much. It was a complete honor. I'm so grateful for the work that you do in terms of continuing to make these sort of transgressive paths possible for all of us, and give your Black girls a hug for me today.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.